Hello everybody. Welcome to the Financing in Space discussion as part of our Space Development Commercial Opportunities track. I'm Jordan Katz, the track monitor. And just first a little administrative announcement. AeroAstro was invited to send a representative from their company to talk about their experiences in financing some of their small satellite business activities, and unfortunately they weren't able to make it. So today we have with us just Mike Ryan. I don't want to say just because I don't want to, but Mike is a professor at the University of North Texas, is involved in their Innovative Management MBA program, and he is a Doctor of Business and Public Policy. And so the good news is we'll bring Mike right to you, and that there will be no final examination at the conclusion of his talk, but we will have a Q&A session. So, Mike?
Now, let me say that this is one of those things that, quote, nice business school professors don't do, which is why there aren't a lot of us who play with this sort of thing. The basis of this presentation is, in part, something that you probably are reasonably familiar with on one sense and probably unwilling to face perhaps on the other. It's why, in many cases, a lot of space ventures not only cannot get funding, but are unlikely to get funding in the near future. A lot of what goes on relative to business funding of any project has to do with the conventional risk and return relationship. In many cases, we take perception of risk relative to almost any space venture. You talk to any standard venture capitalist in this country today, and you mention the word space, and they will stand up and walk out of the room because the perception is there is simply no project which justifies the level of risk that they perceive exists within the space project. The second comment you'll get is that's what the government's supposed to do. Now, there is, of course, the inverse relationship of risk and return. Those of you who are familiar with basic economics 101 understand that the higher the level of risk, the greater the rate of return expected. If you have a return that is less than that which is expected given a particular perceived risk, that's considered an inefficient rate of return, therefore that project will not be funded. If by some quirk of fate, luck, chance, or good management, you have one that generates a higher rate of return than that which is expected, that's considered an extremely efficient investment, and that's the sort of project that everyone wants to invest in. Unfortunately, if you start identifying the types of projects that are space-related that have that extremely high efficiency index, you can't find very many of them. And until you can start identifying some of those things, the likelihood of securing financing for the long term for those sorts of projects is very, very small. The third thing is that obviously the risk assessment affects the investment choices and business strategy. For the most part, what you have to start considering is how can you either increase the rate of return consistent with the expectations of the investment community, or how you can decrease the risk, or preferably how you can do both at the same time. Traditionally, one of the mechanisms that you'll hear people talk about is that to offset risk, somehow you have to get the government involved. I have some colleagues who suggest that the minute the government gets involved, the rate of risk actually increases, in which case that's something that you run away from. I think you can find a suitable role for the government, but it's going to vary depending on the project. Whether you want them as a partner is debatable. Whether you want them as a customer is questionable, depending upon whether you get them to pay up front or not. Whether you want them as a guarantor or an anchor tenant or some other type of support group, proof of concept, may again vary on the project. Next sheet. Bootstrap financing is kind of what I had in mind for this. In other words, the idea is that some projects deserve to be financed, both on their own merits in terms of as an investment, as well as some other things. Toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you a bootstrap scenario, which is a little bizarre, but I think will emphasize why certain projects may be feasible and others aren't. first thing you have to do is you have to look at traditional products and services. The basic question that most people ask about space ventures is, what is the only thing you can do in space? And that, I think, is the wrong question. The question is, what can you do in space that might also be done on Earth or in a terrestrial form, but by doing it in space you gain some economic, competitive, or other sustainable advantage. If you can make that transition from a traditional product in a terrestrial environment to a product in a space environment, you then have the basic underpinnings for a good, solid business. If you have to justify something only in terms of space, it becomes much more difficult because there are no benchmarks, there are no comparison points, there are none of the traditional things you need in order to sell a project to the investment community. Obviously, it's easier to get financial backing if you can tie whatever it is you're doing to something that is familiar to the people with whom you are dealing and trying to get the financing. You need traditional basic market studies, customer analysis, demand curves, anything that says this is a real project with real rates of return and real revenue. If you don't have those things, then you're not going to be able to justify that project. Second, you look for a large market. Now, it's not necessary that you have a large market, but realistically, for a lot of space ventures, the larger the market, the higher your level of credibility is going to be. In other words, if I could demonstrate convincingly that there is a market of, say, 100,000 potential users of my product or service, people start saying, well, you know, how many of those people can you actually expect to get? Well, I might be able to realistically bring on board, say, 10, 20% of those. Now, that's a reasonable market. If I say the market for my product is 50, and I'm only going to get 10% of those, and that's 5 people, then clearly that's a much different situation. Now, it's not that that's not possible. It's just that you start looking at the sorts of normal things that interact in business, competition, substitute products, foul-ups of all sorts. The larger your potential customer base, the likelihood exists that you'll be able to attract enough of those to make your business viable. Next one, please. Third, you want to look at growth potential. Two factors are very attractive to almost any investment group: fast growth or high demand. Either way you go, you can increase the probability of success. If I have a fast growth, then I can start talking about projected rates of return within a fixed time period. The United States, if I can't promise, even with an exaggeration, that there's going to be a reasonable rate of return within about 5 years, I'm probably not talking to people who are going to want to put money in my project. If I'm in Europe, it stretches out to 7 years. If I talk Japanese, I might get 10, 15, 20 years. Realistically, for most investors, the time frame in which the investment is active becomes quite critical, particularly in space. The reason is that by and large, most space ventures have an extraordinarily high upfront cost and a relatively long gestation period. Now that means that you've got two things happening. One, the money that I invest cannot generate any other returns. In other words, I don't have any other activities that are producing revenue which offset the risk. Now, if you come up with a project which says, okay, we're going to have some intermediate returns, not big ones, but intermediate returns of some dimension, then that project is more attractive because I can use those things to offset the other long-term risk. Or I can even take that money and invest in another project which offsets that risk. But if I have no revenue until, say, 7 years out, then essentially you've got my money and I have a negative situation from the standpoint of investment. Now, I'm not going to bug you with net present value calculations and all the funny fancy stuff you do, but by and large, most of those projects end up with a negative net present value. And traditional finance people will tell you it has a negative net present value if you don't invest in it. So you've got to somehow do some things to offset that. Assuming that you have something like that, you want to focus on conventional opportunities that have space potential. The more mundane, the better. One of the things that is very interesting is that you talk about something like the communication industry. Why is communication successful? In part, it's because it's something everybody can understand. You can talk in very simple terms, you can talk in terms of telephones, you can talk in fiber optics if you want to get a little fancier. Satellites in that context are pretty easy to understand. Now, the technical side may be a little bit more difficult for some people, but you have a useful product and service that ties into other things. You talk exotic data utility, you can still explain that in terms of, well, you can get information on the stock market over your telephone line, over your fax line, whatever. So you have basic traditional things to play with. If you can come up with something that is a relatively mundane application that has a space tie-in, it's going to be easier to sell and easier to look at all the things that people are going to want to ask you questions about. Consequently, I always tell people to stick to basics. All right, basic business plan for a good, solid financial venture has got to focus on the product or service. It has to keep the customer in mind. In other words, who the heck is going to be your customer? How are you going to make money over the long haul? A single customer is not a market. A single business is not an industry. Figure out startup costs and problems. Most, and even to a certain extent when I give you the bootstrap scenario I'm going to throw at you, have a tendency to minimize problems, maximize opportunities. In other words, yeah, we're going to have a few problems, but they're not real important. Well, the reality is they are important. And the opportunities are there. Well, the opportunities may be there, but there are always going to be changes. If you look at most new businesses, one of the things that's interesting is that oftentimes they will find opportunities that they did not envision at the start of their business, which they did move into, and then turn out to be one of the primary generators of revenue for that activity. So you have to keep in mind that you're going to have all sorts of things you did not anticipate, and remain flexible enough so that if somebody comes up and says, hey, would you be willing to do such and such, I'm willing to pay money. The money in the hand, the potential for revenue, is generally going to be something to pay attention to. It's better than having prospective revenue. It may require you changing your focus of your business slightly. Keep an eye on profit. There are a tremendous number of people who are interested in doing business in space who simply don't understand that nobody's going to give you money unless they get something back for it. Yes, I agree that we need to be in space. Yes, it's better for mankind. I can give you all the historical examples from exploration to development, whatever else. But fundamentally, if you cannot demonstrate that there is a potential profit in excess of that which you can get from investing in T-bills, it ain't going to happen. Further, given the likelihood of other investment options which have good rates of return that are not quite as scary to people as most space projects are, you're going to have to beat the T-bill rate by probably at least 15 to 20%. Some of my colleagues in finance will tell you that if it's an extraordinary project, having a 5-year or more time frame, you're going to have to show a prospective rate of return in excess of 30%. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I think you're bordering pretty close to it. You want to look for sustainable competitive advantage. The one thing that scares the daylights out of most space venture people is we come up with this really great idea. We spend the 3 years developing it. We spend the 2 years getting it into operation. We spend another year getting the bugs out. And then somebody comes up with something that costs half as much, takes a third of the time, and supplants our product or service tomorrow. So one of the things you have to look for is whether or not you can successfully run your business in a fashion that gives you that sustainable competitive advantage over the long haul. If you cannot envision what that might be, then you really want to reflect upon that, because it may not be the sort of business that people are willing to invest in. Now, sustainable competitive advantage, if you're familiar with all of the relative terminologies, can be anything from offering better service, better quality, better price. But whatever it is, it's got to be something that you can do over a fairly long period of time if you're talking some sort of space business. And then lastly, you want to be able to enhance the business's ability to get into other opportunities. One of the things that most of the space businesses that I have seen to date don't do is they don't have a plan for moving their activity into other arenas. You've got to be able to move from where you are to a bunch of other places, if only to offset the other risks that will come up that you didn't anticipate. By and large, single-focused businesses in space, depending upon who you want to talk to, are by and large not fundable. You've got to be able to demonstrate that this business leads into other opportunities, and that even though we can't take advantage of those opportunities right this second, they will provide other sources of revenue, other customers, other opportunities. If they don't, then something comes up, you're in trouble. Now, developmental scenario. This is basically for fun. Let me give you an example of probably the world's most mundane business: garbage disposal. Now, why do I want to talk about garbage disposal relative to financing? It's because it gives you an example of the type of business that you could build that essentially is very simple, not real complex, has a large supply. I mean, anybody not have problems with garbage, let me know. There's lots of customers. Virtually every individual in the country provides one source, or you can talk in terms of industrial waste, or the example I will use, I'll talk a little bit about high-level waste. And it's a cash crop. In other words, there are no dollars being paid for garbage disposal today. It is a growing business, meaning the increasing amounts of garbage we have on hand is stacking up everywhere. Roughly 25 states will run out of landfill capacity within the next decade. The federal government is still having problems getting its nuclear waste depository online, and people really don't know what to do with it. So there's lots of potential there. Now, key to the service. Envision, if you will, the possibility of building a system that would let us transfer waste material, we'll talk about different types in a second, from a point on Earth to a collection point at low Earth orbit. Then from the collection point at low Earth orbit, we bundle it together and do one of two things. We either recycle it in the sense of using a solar furnace, because solar power is cheap at that point, or the stuff we don't want to keep, we bundle it together and we shoot it into the sun. Now, there are, those of you who are engineers are going to start, all your little technical questions are going to start popping up. I can answer those in the question and answer period 1. But think for a minute what we do. If our launch costs to low Earth orbit are comparable to what we would spend, give or take, to store stuff or to recycle stuff here on Earth, then it might make sense to use that process. If our cost for operating our collection point in space is comparable to what we would pay, let's say, to operate a nuclear waste repository, then I've justified transportation and I've justified space station. Okay? So at that point, I now have the makings for a nice, neat, sustainable business. Now the question is, can I do so? I'll go to the next chart. In terms of other things. Now, there are some interesting advantages over Earth-based alternatives. It provides a permanent solution for nuclear waste if you want to get rid of it permanently. It can be very cost competitive. Now, there are a number of ways of reducing launch costs. One of my favorites for this particular proposal, which I can give you some interesting numbers on, would be the use of a terrestrial-based mass driver, which in case we'll talk in terms of one-ton lots. You can do it using conventional rockets. It gets a little bit trickier and a little more expensive, and there's some other problems. And I can demonstrate some of those. But it solves many people's problems. In other words, we solve the Department of Government's problem, we solve municipalities' problems, we solve all sorts of things. Envision, if you will, a balance of trade situation where we are importing all that wonderful waste from the Commonwealth, or from Europe, or from Japan. Keep in mind that at the present time, people are spending $80 to $200 per ton for standard waste, the stuff that you throw out of your house. They're spending upwards of $2,000 to $5,000 a ton for toxic waste. And depending upon whose numbers you want to quote, the numbers for high-level nuclear waste run upwards of $30,000 to $50,000 a ton. Now, if we say that, well, the cost per pound to low Earth orbit right now is $35,000, you can't do that. I say that's right. But if I can drop launch costs down, I now have a known price for a given service. And if I can push that down far enough, I now have a nice margin. In fact, I now have certain advantages that may make it impossible for some of the other agencies that normally deal with this type of stuff to compete with it. In other words, very few other sources offer permanent solutions. Very few offer some other advantages. Now, end result of doing all this is that if I set up my business properly, I now have a solid rationale for financing a low-cost launch system to Earth orbit. I now have a significantly paid-for rationale for providing an industrial space station. And having those two things operational, I provide a commercial pivot for other businesses in vertical integration. Somebody says, well, what does that mean? That means that, gee, first thing you do if you've got an operative business, and let's say you are making a profit, it may not be large, but let's say we are, you start saying, well, gee, how can I reduce my costs or increase my revenue, or do both, or find other things? Well, I start thinking, I've got an orbiting facility. Maybe if I put some more modules, I can lease them out to companies for $15 to $20 million a year, and they can send somebody up to do research. Maybe. Or maybe if I'm using a mass driver and I'm using a source of electricity to power my magnets, I say, well, you know, I'm tired of buying power from whatever the power company is. So what could I do? Well, you know, we're already up here in orbit. I've been reading stuff on solar power satellites. They're not very efficient, but I got lots of space, lots of room, and power's cheap. What if I build 4 or 5 of those and beam my power back to my mass drivers and backward integrate? Now, having done that, and look at my long-term cost for providing power, I say, well, gee, I've got this capability. I can build these solar power satellites. Each time I build one, we've got more experience. You know, I just read the other day that there's this big concern about electric power, all these different places. Maybe we ought to go into the solar power satellite business. The next thing I'm in is I start selling solar power satellites. Or maybe I lease them, I don't know. That's a different decision. But now I'm in 2 businesses. And guess what? They're the 2 most mundane businesses that there are: garbage disposal and utility plant operation. Okay? Now, traditionally, if you had a utility plant, it was a license for printing money. If you have a garbage license, it was a license for making money. Now, I've got the 2 world's most mundane businesses, and I can probably operate both profitably for a fairly long period of time. Now, who's going to compete with me? Well, to compete with me, they've got to build the same type of facilities or come up with a terrestrial alternative that's better. Now, if I keep my costs low and my operating situation active, that's not likely to happen because they would have to go through the same level of iteration. Now, I may be targeted for government regulation because, gosh, my first reaction is, you know, I've got this interesting monopoly, they've got to raise my prices. If I'm smart, I probably won't. I'll keep it just on the margin of making it uncompetitive for somebody else to move into the business, and just below the threshold where the public screams and the government moves in. That's if I'm smart. Because what I want to do is I want to generate a financial mechanism that lets me do all these other things. Now, having gone that far, it's a question of where do I go from there? All those wonderful little businesses that people say, well, if we only had access to low Earth orbit. Well, I have access to low Earth orbit. My mass driver works remarkably well, not only for garbage, but for resupply purposes. You want to ship water? Fine, we ship water. Anything that's not affected by high acceleration. Now, clearly I need a mechanism for putting people in orbit. Because I'm not talking about just having a man-tended facility. I'm talking about having people there 24 hours a day. And that means I've got to have some way of getting people there. So there are some fundamental limitations. But if you look at the aerospace plane or DSX, maybe that's my option. So effectively what I end up doing is I create a mechanism for a very complicated environment, but it's based on a very mundane business. Now, go to the next little chart and I'll show you some fun things. All right, this is just so that you know I'm not feeding you a line of advanced cow manure. All right. Depending upon, and again, you have to be careful about throwing out numbers indiscriminately. I tend to work with real numbers. The problem is that a lot of the financial information that you really want is either not available or it's not in a form that's usable as real numbers. But just on the nuclear waste side, we generate approximately 1,300 cubic yards per plant, which is roughly 130,000 cubic yards for the industry. You talk in terms of spent fuel alone, that's roughly 33 US tons. The tonnage obviously varies from medical waste because it's more compactable. But figure on probably, you know, anywhere from 5,000 to 7,000 tons of waste a year. We've got 15,000 tons of accumulated inventory. Now, if you'll bear with me for a second and assume for the moment that I have reduced my launch costs via, let's say, the mass driver, and I have my facility in operation. With 15,000 tons, I can make fairly significant profits at even relatively low margins. I don't want to get the used car business and make $100 a ton, but, you know, at $100 a ton, you know, what, $15 million, give or take, 1.5 million, and upwards. Depending upon which set of figures you use, the conventional numbers will tell you that you can probably make just on that alone, in 1-ton lots, roughly somewhere between $25 and $30 million in profit, because you cover your cost on your operations up front. Now, if you add to that, say toxic waste or other things that you don't want to recycle, you start talking in terms of there being 100,000 tons or more of toxic waste. If you talk in terms of municipal waste, not that everybody's going to want to dump their grass and leaves and everything else in our system, but they generate 400,000 tons of municipal waste per day. Now, I don't necessarily want that entire market. I mean, I'll let other people take some of the garbage. But at this rate, if I've got roughly, say 700,000 to 800,000 tons of potential product that I can tap into, then I can figure out how much that I have to have in order to be able to run my system profitably. And the more profitably I can run my system, the more likely it is that people are going to want to use my system because my costs can be controlled. Whereas other costs relative to landfills and other things are probably not going to be as easily controlled. They're just going to keep going up. Now, one of the other reasons that one might even foresee using a mass driver, just as a side note, is let's say from a technical standpoint, I go out to the public and I say, I'm going to launch nuclear waste in a rocket. Do you know what sort of stuff we're going to have? I mean, I don't want to make that statement too loud because I'd like to get out of Washington alive. Advantage of mass driver, you have no propulsion on your payload. You can design a payload container that can take a re-entry. You don't necessarily have to carry a whole ton of waste at one time. I use a ton simply because it's easy to calculate numbers. Most garbage is calculated in cubic feet. A ton is kind of a nice number to play with. So you send less than that, so you have more payloads. Gosh, I might have to charge more money that way. But the point would be that without that possibility of an explosion, you have some real interesting safety advantages, including advantages that you don't necessarily get if you're talking about transporting things by plane, train, or truck, or whatever else. So, in that sense, a mass driver provides some nice, interesting things. Plus, it also gives me the advantage of being able to supply lots of things at low cost over a long period of time. Think of it as a railroad. Okay? The more I use it, the more users that use it, the more I can justify reducing the cost. Yes, sir?
What about Earth first?
What about Earth first? In what sense?
Galileo, just last year, they were surrounding the base to keep us from watching that.
Wow. What did they say about the NIMBYs? You know, everybody ever told you about NIMBYs? Not in my backyard. Okay, you know, that sort of a question is clearly going to be a problem. But I think that if you start talking about, okay, fine, what do you want us to do with this stuff? You know, here's a relatively safe, permanent, system for doing it. Now, if you come up with a better system that you're willing to pay for, or that will pay for itself, then I say fine. If you're not willing to do that, then somebody says, well, don't do anything. Clearly, you're saying you're recommending an alternative that's simply not doable because you just can't leave things the way they are. If somebody says to you tomorrow, well, we'll quit generating waste, that's clearly not a reasonable assessment of what's going on. Now, if I start talking about this type of thing in public and people start saying whatever, then the question is, are they willing to listen to the technical arguments? One of the issues that comes up with something like this is the same thing with finance people. I don't expect finance people to understand the engineering details of a proposal. That's why I hire engineers. I don't expect engineers to necessarily understand the idea that you got to make a profit and no, you can't do this perfect every time. As long as it's within these parameters, we're happy. If people are not willing to listen to the arguments pro and con and make an informed, intelligent judgment and just act on emotion, there's not much you can do with it. Yes, sir?
To be able to produce figures you feel significantly enough, obviously this is an example, but could you produce figures that were significant enough to go out to someone and say, I need $3 billion to develop this mass driver?
Yeah.
Because that's the figures I've heard it'll take to do that kind of mass driver.
The East Coast and West Coast numbers vary by about 200%. My East Coast engineering connection says 2.4 billion. My West Coast engineering connection says somewhere between 800 million and 1.5 billion. I think you could do it if you were willing to put up the money to do the project. The problem that you have is you could build a mass driver, assuming that you've got your technology lined up, probably about 2.5 to 3 years. It's not a real complicated engineering project as those sorts of things go. You build your modules so that they're easily replaceable. One of the guys earlier we were talking about what happens if something explodes. And somebody says, well, what could explode? Well, if let's say you have pressurized liquids or pressurized gases, and something happens and you blow up in a section of the driver, well, You know, what happens when a train goes off the tracks? You cut out the section of track, you put in a new section of track, and you're operative within, you know, hours to days. So in that sense, yeah, I think you could actually develop the numbers to go out and do that. Now, keep in mind, the mass driver itself is useful in this construct, but it needs to be in concert with a man-operated facility in orbit, because as one of the people I know has suggested, well, you just launch stuff out in space. We're not going to do that. We've learned that lesson, I would hope, by dumping stuff in the oceans. So, you know, the argument that I'm trying to build is that you can build a basic business plan with solid financials to do the things everybody wants to do, which is get to Earth orbit cheaply, have a man-operated space station, let you do all sorts of things, eventually go to the moon, and have a permanent habitat. The difference is that I think you can do it with private funds as well as you can with public funds. Now, realistically, you may have a combination of both, but it's doable if you stick to basic business fundamentals and look for things that have known customers, known utility, and can generate reasonable profits. I'm not talking obscene profits, but just reasonable profits. And then, of course, if you look at this, the assumptions clearly are if you assume that the cost of launch drops significantly and the cost of launch and disposal is less than alternatives over time, and the supply of garbage remains high, you should have a basic business with good margins that provides a solid platform for other types of ventures.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
Just running out your numbers here, if you combine nuclear waste and municipal waste, you come up with a $44 billion a year revenue stream.
Yes.
As basically what I guess the United States or the world pays.
Just U.S.
Okay, just the U.S.
Just
pays
US.
a year to dispose of nuclear and municipal garbage. Well, if that's the case, and there's got to be some person who also reads into the numbers at Waste Management Inc. Why is Waste Management Inc. going out and lining up about $20 billion worth of capital to build rail launchers here, develop the single stage to orbit, the space station, rail launchers so you can build the Delta V up to throw the stuff into the sun, whether that's based in the moon, on the moon or L1 and so forth. I mean,
Case in point, why doesn't BFI do that?
That's right.
Or
Right.
whatever. It's because those sorts of projects, the minute you talk space, initially scare them. Okay? Or you can make the same argument that would say, why? And if any of you work for General Dynamics, my apologies. But I went to a conference once where they were talking about building tractors to operate in a lunar environment. And my question was, why is General Dynamics designing tractors? Why don't you go to Caterpillar and see if you can adapt a tractor? I mean, Caterpillar builds tractors. General Dynamics doesn't build tractors. I mean, there seem to be some fundamentally interesting things that occur where basic businesses do not look at space as an opportunity. And you have to go out literally and talk to them and explain that you're not talking about anything that's any more difficult, let's say, than if they build their own rail line to their own disposal site. And once they look at it and they have their people examine the proposals, they might very well go out and start doing that. That's one of the things I'm trying to get businesses to do. The space business community, and this is my opinion, is by and large limited fundamentally by the fact that basic industries are not represented in meetings like this. In other words, the big construction companies, the big manufacturers. As long as a conference does not attract, or I should say an organization doesn't attract some of these other things, you're not going to have these types of things happen.
Lack of information crossover.
Yeah, but that's always been the case. The best financed people in the world are consultants who take their little pockets with them, go from company to company, and take what they learn one place and go someplace else. You know, we used to talk about that being the bumblebee effect. That a good bumblebee is essential to a well-functioning industry.
Yeah, I just add a comment to what you were saying to George. What is a very, very common effect is that existing stable companies often do not innovate the industry. A good example would be publishing. Publishing houses were not the ones to innovate electronic publishing. It's outside of their normal business. They know how they want to go about it. The new business is going to undercut their old way of looking at things. So it's very often it takes the entrepreneurial firm to come in and change the way of doing business. Then the old companies come along and buy them out. They still can't.
Yeah, well, nowadays you talk about setting up a startup that does that, and you always envision the company that has an interest in your activity because you look at them as the potential buyout candidate. And in fact, that's the most conventional way of making reasonably large dollars in a short period of time. You set your business up as a potential acquisition candidate, and you do that up front. In fact, when we're talking about startup businesses, I won't even talk to people who don't even envision the possibility of selling that business because it means that they're not looking at some things they need to be looking at.
But let me just inject though a dose of reality. In my experience, I completely understand the frustration with the current aerospace industry. I know that in my dealings with McDonnell Douglas on the SSRT program, the commercial space launch market for cheap access to space is right there in front of them, and they still won't. They invest some of their funds, their own funds in SSRT, and we're very grateful for that at SDIO. But developing follow-on commercial vehicles, they're waiting for the government to step up and pay for it. And I think with some of the larger companies, I mean, when we talk about a real business situation where the numbers speak louder than the gee whiz, let's face it, I mean, people are successful financial consultants or successful venture capitalists or whatever. They're successful because they're able to look at the numbers and disassociate themselves and be able to weigh the risk out. And I think when you talk about sending up some 146 million tons of municipal waste up into space a year in order to capture $43 billion worth of revenue. I mean, the technology is not there. And I don't care whether the East Coast or the West Coast says it, railguns are not there yet. And they're not $3 billion.
But my point.
And I understand, you're saying that, yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of engaging the right people to get the job done, but I don't think it's that easy. And I have to come to a little bit of the defense of mainstream industry, in that, not necessarily aerospace industry, but the mainstream industry, in that there are people out there looking at numbers that are smart people, and if they felt that there was a risk, that the technology was there, that there was a product that they could come forward with, that would be able to capture some of this revenue, be able to amortize it, and I think they'd move forward and do it. And I think Iridium this morning, I mean, that's a very risky program, very risky. And we're talking about technology that's on the shelf. We're not talking railguns and mass-produced space stations and mass-produced single-stage to orbit SSX type vehicles and railguns up on the moon and operating in all sorts of environments that really we still don't know about yet. And I think that even though the numbers speak loud and the revenue stream speaks loud, there's still a very long way to go before the standard Wall Street business analyst can look at a revenue stream like $44 billion in a task of pumping 146 million tons of garbage into space a year.
But my point initially in talking about this was the fact that, at its lowest level, this is a basic, no complication type business. In other words, we don't have to worry about markets, we don't have to worry about customers, we don't have to worry about all those traditional things. Now, granted, the technology's not there. I use the mass driver as an example, primarily because it is unknown technology. Okay. Now, if you want to use traditional, expendable launch vehicles, again on which set numbers you want, you might not want to send all that waste. Okay, but selectively, you could still make a good business if you could prove, at least to some people, that you could drop launch costs down to say, maybe $1,000 a ton. Now, at that point, in fact, I'll even throw in my little thing for the journal that I'm associated for. There's an article coming out in the next issue of Space Commerce that talks about some different things that may reduce launch costs down into the hundreds of dollars. Now, again, that technology is not particularly exotic, and there might be a basis for dealing with some of this material within that construct. All I'm suggesting is that this type of approach in terms of examining things serves as a different basis for justifying the type of access and activity in space than what you often see. In other words, I'm not saying that you go to space for all the other reasons I might want to say. I'm saying, look, there's some legitimate business reasons. Now, granted, the technology might not be there in the most fundamentally safe, secure way I would like to say, but it still says that if we look at some of these applications in a more basic business construct, we will find solid, financially acceptable, financeable activities that we can do. Instead of talking about things that we can't do because nobody wants to give us the money, we need to be thinking about those things we can do and justify having someone give us the money in the first place. So I agree with the technology. The reason that mass drivers have some appeal, particularly relative to the nuclear waste examples, because you eliminate a lot of the real hardcore objections about using it. The nuclear waste also represents the highest value added product that you can launch relative to waste. In other words, if you talk about what it costs us to do different wastes, high-level nuclear waste is the most expensive to deal with, and therefore would represent the initial, the highest profit segment of that particular business. So I throw that as the example. Yes, sir?
It occurs to me that there may be some synergy between the cost of getting rid of something on Earth and the cost of importing something to the moon. So if you subtract the cost that someone would otherwise pay just to get rid of it, some of the waste materials that you're looking at disposing of on Earth, in fact, may be resources that you'd like to use in a lunar base. So what you've done is by merging those two perspectives is potentially lower the cost of your lunar supply.
When we talk about recycling, the thing you have to recognize, it's always amazing to me, there have been instances where people have ended up paying as much as $5,000 and $7,000 a ton to get rid of what we consider to be fairly conventional waste. Again, my comment is that assuming that you push launch costs down to something that is near reasonable, I always think in terms of what's the margin. Well, if the cost of doing something is over here and somebody's willing to pay this, and I look at can I get these two things closer together, then the basic conception for a business becomes possible, particularly at the transition point. So if I can push launch costs down, whatever my mechanism, and I look at the cost of dealing with garbage, which is continuing to escalate, then in my mind that there is a clear basis for some sort of business. Now, whether you want to develop all the peripheral ancillary activities, that may be a totally different question. But I would agree with you. Obviously, if you can recycle stuff and you don't have to import stuff, it's cheap.
An important point we found out in the commercial space policy, and it gets back to the problem of space transportation, is that if you look at your average VCR and you ask yourself, in the $500 I paid for that VCR, what percentage of that is made of space, is comprised of transportation and shipping, from pieces, parts from Japan to Malaysia, where they're assembled in subsystems, where they're sent to Mexico, where they're integrated into a final VCR, where they go through product distribution, and finally hit your shelf. The thing's probably gone in mileage, gone around the Earth once in equivalent mileage, and transportation cost there is under 20% of your total price you paid, maybe 5%. The problem is in commercial space, in commercial space ventures right now, we're looking at about 50-50 split. And you see any communication satellite that goes up, the cheaper communication satellites that go up, launch costs are equal to the price of the satellite in many cases. And particularly sometimes when you're talking about insurance and all the extras and paying the overhead for using U.S. launch facilities and financing the stumbling boards out at our various launch ports, then you've gone over that. And so we're talking about a real fundamental drop in space transportation costs. Now, maybe having a logistics problem of launching 146 million tons of something somewhere up into space might encourage the Fleur Daniels and the other Octels and the Shimizos of the world to figure out how to deal with such a logistics problem, and which will be the only economies of scale that will bring the cost.
I always get tickled because if you think about the problems, for example, with most transportation systems, once the system is in place, then the question is, will people use the system? And historically, if you go back and look at railroad development or commercial airline industry or whatever else, after the system was online, it took some extraordinary efforts to get people to use those systems, and thereby take those steps that would reduce the cost of operating that transportation system. For a whole variety of reasons, some of which we've touched on, some of which are probably not appropriate to this forum. Launch costs relative from Earth to space have simply not dropped to the point where most of the types of business ventures that people would like to think about are sustainable. You just can't do it.
They haven't dropped.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Well, actually, you know, if you want to look at one set of numbers, they've gone up. But the practical matter is that from a business standpoint, you don't have, you know, you talk about man-rated systems. Well, we don't have a business-rated system. We don't have a system that's affordable, available, or accessible to the average business type of activity. And until you have that type of system, the likelihood of some of these projects actually, you know, coming to fruition is very, very small. You just can't get there from here. Which is really quite a shame, because there are a lot of neat projects that people said, well, if I could do this, I could do that, but you can't do that yet. Yes, sir.
Have you done any comparative analyses of how this type of a business plan would compare to either the development of the railroad infrastructure in the late 1800s or the development of the airline infrastructure in the mid-20th century?
I've done part of one, I'm working on another one, and there's some very bizarre things that happen, and without boring you with numbers, one thing that's very curious is that transportation systems seem to follow online one after the other. One system supplants another. So if you look at commercial shipping, followed by, say, commercial railroads, folled by either automobile, trucking, or aircraft, there is a curve that kind of looks like almost like a product demand curve, where you reach a certain point, it flattens off, and then demand begins to drop a little bit. The only curve that doesn't do that is with space transportation. Now, it's possible, and I have to kind of give you a caveat for this. It's possible I'm not exactly looking at the right numbers at this point in time, but if you look at tons to orbit, people being flown, or whatever else, you end up with this funny curve that looks kind of like this. In other words, you don't have the increasing payload, decreasing cost, or the increasing number of people using the system. Now,
you've got a shorter time span too.
Well,
if you use the railroad analogy, the first steam locomotives were maybe 100 years before widespread rail links through the continental U.S.
That's true, but the commercial airline traffic was roughly half of that,
right,
and commercial automobile traffic was half of that. Right. So if we were saying that those things were roughly analogous one to the other, then you would have expected that there would have been roughly a 15 to 20 year delay in terms of space transportation. And instead that hasn't happened.
Well, I know where we're at now is irrelevant. I'm saying in terms of having data to back up a business plan, I think you've got some pretty good analogies, because in those industries you have what amounts to an oligarchy of a half dozen tops players that actually go out and do it. In most cases, and during the critical build-up period, they're led by, driven companies with dynamic CEOs, the Carnegies and Mellons, and, those guys, and the equivalent in the aerospace industry from the 40s on, 30s and 40s on out.
There's also some other things that have to be, like, for example, if you look at railroads, the government's effort to make land available to you,
right,
and if you look at commercial aviation, things like airmail contracts that provided sustainable revenues while you were building these other sorts of things. A lot of those aspects simply are not in place. Now, even at this conference, okay, people are debating various policies about what could you do to encourage certain types of activity that would either increase the number of launches, decrease costs, increase activity on all different things. And there's not a lot of agreements to what is going to work.
You had the Department of Energy issuing a purchase order to unload the stuff at Hanford at $100 a pound into low Earth orbit. Don't care how it gets there, as long as it's safe and highly redundant and effective. That's the analogy to the airmail contract. That would be the analogy to the airmail contract.
We want it from here to there. You figure out how, and operate accordingly. Yeah.
This is the last time. I was just going to say also, you have to remember that it's only been about 6 years since the Commercial Space Act made it possible for a commercial launch.
That's true.
So this is a very young industry we're looking at as far as commercial viability.
That's true. But it's also one where one would hope to see a little bit more rapid development. One of the things that people ask me from other industries is, what's the deal? Why is it so slow? In other words, the things they're looking at are like personal computers or automobiles or commercial aviation, and the comparisons that they want to make simply don't seem to be as relevant in the area of space. And we can debate about a lot of various reasons for that, but they're just not. Now, Jordan said last question, so I guess that will do it. I apologize for being the only one here, but
It's not your fault.
it's not my fault, right? I guess it would have been my fault if I hadn't been here.
Actually, thank you very much. That was an extremely interesting discussion on prospective financing and community-based ventures.